Good day, everybody, and welcome back to the NASTD IT 101 series. My name is Brad Steele. I'm the Senior Director of Unified Communications for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, EOTSS, and a NASTD past president. NASTD is the National Association of State Technology Directors and is made up of technology professionals serving state government. It is a member-driven organization whose purpose is to advance and promote the effective use of information technology and services to improve the operation of state government. Article 1, Section 2, under Purpose and Goals of the NASTD Constitution, has the second goal as engage in programs for the training, education, and development of technology professionals from all areas of state government. To help accomplish this goal, we decided to put together a set of educational videos we call the IT 101 sessions to help with this education. In these videos, we are asking industry leaders from our corporate affiliate community 10 plus or minus questions, pretty much standard questions about a specific technology or service, something that's either new to the environment or, as I like to call them, understood technologies. If you haven't seen the videos we put together in the past, I ask that you go back to the NASTD website, nastd.org. At the bottom of the page, you should see a link to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous videos we've done. Once on the YouTube channel, I do ask that you go in and hit the subscribe button. We're looking to get 100 subscribed users so that we can do a customized YouTube link. The topic for today's discussion is RPA, or Robotic Process Automation. This topic was brought to us by Deb Rossi over at Blue Prism, who put me in touch with James Spencer from her team. James Spencer has spent the last 5 years as Blue Prism's Director of Solutions Engineering for public sector markets. In addition to cultivating a team of solution engineers, he also works closely with public sector organizations to help them understand how to get started with RPA/IA, identify and optimize intelligent automation use cases, and to scale their automation capabilities. Prior to joining Blue Prism, James oversaw solutions engineering for IASD, a data analytics startup. James is based in Washington, D.C. And I always ask for a fun fact when I saw this one, and it really made me smile. So James is accredited by the Maryland Association of Agricultural Fairs and Shows to judge home arts entries at county fairs across Maryland, but his specialties are baked goods, cakes, breads, pies, cookies, etc., fruits and vegetables, and preservation, pickles, jams, vinegars, etc. So welcome, James.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Glad to be here.
So tell me about judging at state fairs. That must be fun.
Yeah, it's interesting because as a resident of Washington, D.C., we're obviously a fairly small area for a city. And so we don't have any sort of county fairs of our own. And a couple of years ago, I got into gardening. And as a result of gardening, I had so many extra pickles and tomatoes and things like that. And I couldn't give them away anymore. So I had to figure out what to do with them without throwing away all that perfectly good produce. And so that got me into home preservation. And it turns out that Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just across the border to the north of us, will willingly accept DC residents into their fair. And so I actually entered the fair as a contestant, as an entrant. And I'm pleased to say my pickles won the blue ribbon that year, which was fun. But that got me wondering about, well, gee, wouldn't it be fun to do judging as well? And so I ended up talking to a few people and went down the route. And it turns out there is a formal training process and an accreditation. So now what I like to do is to really take the skills that I built in my own kitchen and apply those to judging at county fairs across the state of Maryland.
Love it. All I can say is if I were a judge at county fairs, I would probably weigh 300 pounds. So although I tend to sample all of them anyway, so I might as well be judging and making myself useful while I'm there, right?
The key is small bite, because otherwise you fill up.
There you go. All right. And while I could talk about pies and cakes all day long, let's get into our topic for today. So the first question, start off with the very basics. What is robotic process automation?
So really, in a nutshell, when we talk about RPA or robotic process automation, what we're really talking about is another option for labor. But in this case, instead of it being humans doing work, it is a digital sourcing option. So, of course, every state agency has its own pool of human employees, and they're focused on different roles and responsibilities depending on what their position description entails. And so, of course, when they're at work, they're focused on different things that pertain to their job. Well, so if we're talking about the digital workforce, really what that is think about a digital worker or digital assistant, whatever term you want to use, that can essentially work alongside those human employees and provide an additional capacity for getting work done. So really, it's all about, if you think about the things human employees can do when it comes to interacting with various different systems and applications, that they can understand how to use SAP or Excel or a mainframe. They have the ability to interact with a mouse and a keyboard. And so a digital worker provided by RPA can do the same thing. It can really interact with any number of target applications. It can move data between different systems. And so it's there available to pick up work from humans as needed, or to provide work to them. So I think actually getting to the robotic side of things, when we talk about robotic process automation, the term robotics, I think, gives people a bit of pause if they're not familiar with RPA, and it makes them think of industrial automation. They think of, the big robotic welding arms that are used on car assembly lines. And so I think it's important also to point out that in this case, there's no actual physical robot there. It's just software, but it still is robotic in that it will do a repeatable process over and over and over without fail.
Excellent. So the robotic uprising, I don't have to worry about that in this particular.
That's right. That's right.
Excellent. So why would states be interested in RPA, and how would they use it?
Sure. So there's a number of reasons why I think state governments would be interested in RPA, and actually I think those align very closely with the same reasons we see our counterparts on the commercial side of business being interested in it. Namely, again, a capacity for getting more work done. So when we think about it in the context of state governments, I think one of the common mantras that we've heard so often is do more with less. And so I think we've all seen that the workloads that state agencies have never really go down, right? There's always more services to provide, more citizens to look after, more work to get done. But unfortunately, the same isn't true of their budgets. In most cases, I think those budgets stay static or maybe have a paltry increase. But in some cases, they also go the other way. They actually get cut. And so that's very difficult, of course. How can you continue to provide a common level of service to an increasing number of people when your budgets aren't keeping pace? And so, of course, during the pandemic, that really has been put on its head a little bit because, of course, so many state coffers are flush with funds from the federal government around recovery. And so that's enabled states to really take on a lot of tasks that they couldn't do previously. It's had a lot of really good impact in areas such as childhood poverty, et cetera. But unfortunately, those funds are limited and they're eventually going to expire. We're starting to see that now already. And once that happens, the states are going to be back in the same situation before, where they've got to provide a high level of work, but without having a lot of financial resources to go into it. So when you think about what RPA can do, again, in terms of expanding the capacity and the throughput of your human workforce to do work, that's where this will really excel. It's the ability to get more done in a day without having the usual capital expenditures associated with bringing on more and more people. So, as my colleague Deb is fond of saying, nobody ever complained that government delivered services too quickly. And on the other side, too, I think no government employee ever complained that they were underutilized or they didn't have enough work to do. And so that's kind of exactly where RPA fits squarely in there, right? It can help us deliver more services at a quicker pace to our citizens, and also can help the human workforce within the government agency work more effectively. So that's certainly a part of it. I think also, really, even before the pandemic, a lot of state agencies were really worried about the silver tsunami, as they called it, right? We know that the state workforces tend to be older than the commercial counterparts, and there is going to come a day where more and more citizens or more and more employees decide that they're ready to retire, and the states are really going to struggle to keep up backfilling them, and so that's going to be a problem. And of course, that's been compounded again by the COVID pandemic as well, because we've seen that great resignation where so many employees have started thinking more critically about their jobs and decided, do I really get enjoyment out of this role? And do I think I'm making a difference? And if not, maybe it's time for me to find something else to do. So in combination, of course, that makes staffing even more difficult than it already was for state agencies. And I think eventually they're going to figure out a way to fix that, right? There's going to be a lot of people thinking up creative solutions and how to inspire younger people and make them realize it's not all red tape. You can actually make a difference in people's lives. But at some point, there needs to be a stopgap measure as well to say, how can we ensure that the work continues to get done, even if we end up with diminishing number of employees? And so I think that's where RPA will also fit very well. So in terms of use cases, I think when people hear RPA, when they think about RPA, they're mostly thinking about business operations that occur kind of in the back office. So things like general ledger reconciliation or invoice processing. These things that are critical for business operations, but aren't terribly exciting and don't really bring most people a lot of joy. And part of that is correct. I mean, that's certainly a big value proposition for RPA. We see a lot of uses that are really involved in that back office mundane process world. But that's also a bit of an antiquated view, because really what we're seeing is a lot of our customers and users have decided, well, wait a second, why should we limit robotic process automation to the back office when we can use this in front office processes, or maybe even citizen engagement type work? And so really, when we talk about use cases, it may sound a bit hyperbolic to say, but the sky's the limit, because there are so few processes that would not lend themselves well to automation. So some examples when we're talking about citizen engagement, any sort of process that involves applications, an application where a citizen is applying for a service, whether that is social services, whether they need SNAP or TANF or other assistance benefits. Maybe they need a license to go hunting or to drive their car, to start a business. Maybe they're applying for Medicaid, whatever that might be. That fundamentally involves that citizen submitting an application, and then someone on the government side has to go through and review the application, make sure all the data is there, make sure that it aligns to the information contained within their systems of record to make sure that they can make an eligibility determination. Well, that's fundamentally a rules-based process, so there's no reason why that couldn't be automated. Some other examples include we have a state that is actually using this for firearms licensing, where when they have citizens who are applying for the ability to carry a weapon, obviously a big part of that is conducting a background check to make sure they don't have any criminal record. Well, in this case, that is something that can easily be automated too. Rather than having to have some overworked clerk spend all their time going through a bunch of background checks, that can be handed off to a digital worker who can then collate the information, format it in a very useful way, and then send it back to the clerk, who can then look at that digest and say, okay, based on this information that's been collected for me, I can make a judgment and do so in a streamlined process. We have another state that is focused on updating their maps for their Department of Tourism. And so one of the things those maps include is information about different retailers. So if you need to find a gas station or a store to buy products at, well, historically, those have favored the large commercial enterprises, the big box stores that are multinational conglomerates, and really the mom and pop small businesses have been left out of that. And so this state is actually looking at using robotic process automation to go through all of the state corporation commission records to say, well, wait a second, why can't we take these independent shops and restaurants and add those to the tourist maps as well, to really do a great job of promoting local businesses. So other examples really quickly include healthcare. Of course, every state is involved at some point in healthcare. There's lots going on there with physician credentialing and being able to schedule appointments, determining eligibility, et cetera. And also contact centers, right? I think, again, most states probably have at least one, if not multiple contact centers. But yet, if you polled the citizens, very few people would actually say that is something they enjoy, that they really want to spend more time on hold on the contact center. And so why can't you use something like RPA to, again, work in conjunction with that human contact center agent to queue up information in a faster way? So that way the call lasts longer. The contact center agent on the other side doesn't have to do as many keystrokes. So really, it's all about these opportunities to work together in a more effective and efficient way.
So, you talk about the employee stuff, just so you know, at the NASDD regionals, that is, a major topic of concern with people leaving. Tough to hire people, especially with the remote workforce, the ability for, some of these larger companies to allow people to work anywhere in the world, and, states, usually want people to be within their borders and like that. So it is more difficult to hire every day. But when you talk about putting these things in place, how is it different? Couldn't we just rely on scripting and macros and things like that for automating that work? How does RPA enhance that or differ from that?
Sure. So the short answer is yes, you absolutely could rely on scripting and macros, but the longer answer is it's maybe not the best idea. And there's a few reasons why. So when you think about RPA as a technology, it's relatively young. It's only been around for a little over 20 years now. And so really anyone who's worked in technology knows that for many decades before that, we had scripting and macros as a way to automate work. And they worked fairly well, albeit on a smaller scale. And so really some of the biggest problems with those is that they require, they've got a high level of entry to get into, right? They require people who have pretty strong technical backgrounds, who know scripting languages, who know Python or C or Java or whatever it might be. And so if we're talking about personnel, it's already hard enough to find people who want to work for state governments. But when you're also trying to find someone who has a relatively rare skill set that commands a top dollar pay point, that becomes very difficult. So there really aren't enough IT people around to write scripts for everything. And when we think about macros are great. They're an easy way to again automate a workflow, or at least a subset of it. But anyone who's ever built one of those will also tell you they're very fragile. They are very susceptible to environmental changes. So let's say that the application window on the screen moves, or the resolution changes, or the font is different. Suddenly that will cause it to break. So when you're talking about RPA, what that really does is that's lowering the barrier of entry into automation. It's all about how do we democratize data and provide a capability that is no longer stuck squarely within the realms of the IT crowd, but is something that can be used by the actual operational team. So when you've got an RPA solution, that really provides you with a code-free approach to building out automation. So ideally, when you're using something like a Blue Prism solution, that gives you a visual design canvas where you're dragging and dropping elements onto the screen. It's almost analogous to building something out with Lego blocks, which I think everyone's done. It's very simple. You've got all these modular components, and you can reuse them infinitely, and you can reconfigure them in any possible combination. So that's really the benefit of using RPA over something like a macro or a script.
Awesome. Don't say Lego too loud. My son and his girlfriend will come down. They just took a trip to Legoland. All right, so I hear you. I hear you talking about RPA and then intelligent automation. I hear that term quite a bit. They seem to get used interchangeably sometimes. Are they the same thing, or if not, what are the differences?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So RPA and IA which is intelligent automation, are really two sides of the same coin. So they are different, but they work hand in hand together. So when we think about what RPA is and what it's done, historically, when we think back to the earliest days, back in the early 2000s, when RPA was first created, it was really, for lack of a better term, kind of a dumb technology. And I mean that in terms of it was strictly deterministic, if this, then that type logic. So there was really no judgment capability. The digital workers would only do what they were told, only what they were programmed to do. And that's fine. That fulfills quite a number of processes that don't have any room for logic. But at the same time, that inability to be more human-like and to apply a judgment to a problem also limits the type of processes that you can interact with. And so if you think about intelligent automation, that's almost like RPA 2.0. That's how can we make RPA a little bit more human-like, and also how can we provide it with additional skills and additional tool sets that are not focused squarely on just the actual creation and execution of the automation itself. So some good examples there include the ability to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning as part of a process automation. Historically, AI and ML has also been something that's out of the reach of most people. That's been squarely the realm of data scientists. And so if we're talking about using RPA as a way to democratize data, why not do that from the AI and ML perspective as well? So that includes any number of features. That includes the ability to create your own machine learning classifiers or predictive algorithms without resorting to code and being able to use that as part of a process. That's part of it. Also, how can you, again, provide more human-like skills for the digital workforce? So if you're for instance, presenting an image to a digital worker. Well, historically, it wouldn't make any sense out of that. It just sees it as ones and zeros. It doesn't really understand a photograph the way that we humans would. Well, there's of course any number of really great computer vision tools out there that will let your computer tell you, oh, that's a photograph of a truck or of a cloud in the sky, whatever it might be. And so that becomes very beneficial because it really kind of broadens the potential use cases for RPA. So many different states have 311 or some other way for their citizens to submit a ticket if there's a problem. Maybe there's a pothole on your road, or maybe there's a power line that's fallen down. Well, wouldn't it be great if a citizen could snap a photo on their phone, and when they submit that trouble ticket to the city for work, they include the photograph, and part of that could include a digital worker that looks at the image and verifies the information to say, yes, I can tell that's a pothole, and I can even give you an estimated size of that pothole. Or if we're looking at the downed wire, well, let's say the telephone pole itself is also in the image and it has a serial number on it. Well, we can read that serial number and then figure out precisely on what grid square of the map is that pole, so we know where to send the utility crew. Really great example. I think another one really includes intelligent document processing, where if you provide a document, either structured, semi-structured, or even unstructured to a digital worker, can it understand what's going on? Can it classify that document and say, this is a tax return, this is a letter requesting assistance, whatever that might be? And moreover, can it understand what is being asked in that document, or what is the purpose of that document, and therefore extract the key information from it without any human intervention? So those are two really great examples around machine learning. But if we think kind of more broadly about how do we add intelligent automation, like I mentioned, it's not just the tactical exercise of creating the automation, but it's also the more strategic view. So if we're looking upstream and downstream, how do agencies know where they even need to start? What processes should they automate? So we need to give them tools, or we do give them tools, I guess I should say, that take a data-driven approach, and we'll look at their existing computer data and say, oh, got it. These are all the processes you have, and based on these metrics, we can go through and we can make a determination as to whether or not this is a good candidate for automation or not. And once you've built that automation on the other end, you need to be able to monitor it to make sure that not only is it performing as expected just from a purely mechanistic perspective, but also let's look at the return on investment. Is this behaving as expected? Is there a way we can make this more efficient? Are we saving more time and money than we thought we might? All those types of things. So really, when we talk about intelligent automation, think about it as being a wrapper around RPA, and how can we make RPA better?
All right. So that last question kind of ties into my next question. So now we know what it is. How do we get started? Where do we look to get started? And what should we be looking for, when we're planning to try and avoid any pitfalls or other obstacles?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So really the nice thing about RPA is that it does have a very low barrier to entry, because you can simply go onto the website, you can download a trial version, you can start playing with it, which is fantastic, right? You get really, really easy insight into how you would build out an automation and what it does. But at the same time, it also helps to think strategically about, well, what are you really trying to do? Nobody should really be automating simply for the sake of creating an automation. There needs to be some value to it. And so the easiest way, or I think maybe one of the most important ways to get started, is to think about, how does this align to your existing goals, either at the agency level or even more broadly at the state level, right? Whether it's the governor or the legislature who's pushed some sort of initiative. Is there a way that you can align those together to say we can make this part of that overarching goal? So that's really important. And so it's also helpful to think holistically about what are you trying to do with your automation. So part of that includes giving some insight into what I want to automate. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have tool sets available that you can use to run through those scenarios to say, well, I've got X, Y, and Z processes. These are all the different steps that are involved. And then the underlying algorithm is going to chew through and say, okay, based on all these different steps that I see your analyst taking, I think you can automate this. You can expect to save this amount of time, this amount of effort. And it can even go so far as actually building out part of that process for you, which is great, because of course it really reduces the amount of time for development. But in addition to just thinking about what do you have to automate and where do you get started, it's also thinking about who are the key personnel that should be involved in this, right? You need to have some sort of group of experts that can be involved in this. And so that needs to be many different people. It needs to be someone who is just focused on the RPA proponent itself. You need to have the technical staff who actually are responsible for building out. And actually, I say technical, that's not quite correct, but the people who are doing the technical work of building the processes. And as I mentioned, since it's code free, they can be business experts as well. But you need to have to just determine who is building the automation. It's very helpful to have executive sponsorship as well. So someone at the senior level who can really drive change and can make this happen and give you the resources you need. You need to have interactions also with your IT department, right? Even though this is not specifically an IT tool, IT still plays a very important role in this. So you want to make sure you involve them early and have them as part of the process, because if nothing else, they can ensure that they're providing the underlying infrastructure on which this will operate and make sure it's secured. You need to make sure that you have interactions with the system owners of the various different systems of record your digital workers may be talking to. So there's any number of things that you need to keep into play. And I think different RPA vendors have different thoughts around that. Within Blue Prism, we call it a robotic operating model, or ROM, which is available on our website. And it goes in depth about all these different areas. How do you get started? Who are the key people to involve, to be involved with? How do you build out your pipeline of automations, et cetera? So in terms of pitfalls, there really are a couple. And I think part of it is exactly as I said, making sure that you're thinking about this holistically when you're starting, and you're thinking about the entire big picture and not just the little picture, because that does make it very easy to scale. I mean, most organizations are going to start off very small. They're not going to scale right away, but it's so much easier to scale and to develop this into a bigger capability if you've already laid the groundwork up front. It's kind of like building out a house where you need to spend a lot of time and effort building out that strong foundation, because everything else rests on top of it. And that's the same here. There are other things to keep in mind too, just from a security perspective, right? I think it's very easy to go say, well, we're building out this automation and Fred's the one building it, so let's just have Fred reuse his credentials, and the digital worker can use Fred's credentials to log into these various different systems. Well, yeah, that's easy, but is that really a good idea? Probably not from an audit perspective, because if something happens, if there's a mistake, or if there's some sort of malicious activity, well, then we need to kind of go through those logs and forensically determine, was it Fred who did this, or was it a digital worker? And it's a lot easier to figure that out when there's actually dedicated credentials that only that digital worker can use. So those are some of those. I think also, don't be fooled by the easy button approach, right? I think it's very seductive to say, well, I just want to take this simple approach and just kind of slap something on my desktop and be done with it. Well, yeah, there's some value there for sure, because it'll make maybe individual employees a little bit happier. But does that really do much in terms of helping you achieve your overarching productivity goals? If you've got individual desktop workers that don't really talk to each other and don't work when the employees have gone home for the day, well, that's fairly limiting to what you can do from a scale perspective and from a transformational perspective. So, recognize the fact that you probably are going to have to put in a little bit of hard work up front to think about this the right way. And the good news is you're not alone, right? You can work directly with vendors like Blue Prism to get what are their best practices, what do they recommend. You can work with partner organizations. You can even work with other states. We have many other states out there that are doing this work and are no longer novices themselves. And in my experience, they're always happy to lend some advice to a fellow state to say, hey, this is what we've done. This is what we would recommend avoid doing. This is what you need to do to be successful. So I think all of that really comes into play to say, how do you do RPA, but do it in the right way? And that really is all about ensuring your success in the future.
Okay. So in doing a little research, I saw a couple of different terms here. So attended and unattended automation. What is the difference, and what does that mean?
Yeah, that's something we hear a lot too. So the difference between attended and unattended automation really comes down to how much human intervention is involved in this process. And actually, it's really important that you mention those. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think ideally as an RPA solution, you want to have a platform that really is capable of supporting either one of those, either or both of those, really, both attended and unattended. And the reason for that is because there's really no value in having a static solution that can only do attended or can only do unattended, because different agencies are going to have different requirements, and some processes need to be attended, some do not. It just kind of depends on what the process is doing and what the end goal is. So if we talk about an unattended process, what that really means is that is an automation that can run what we might call lights out. It can start all by itself, it can finish all by itself, and it doesn't require any human intervention. And so there are different ways that that can start. It can be kicked off just by means of a schedule where it hits a certain date and time and it knows, oh, I got to start this process, let me go through and do it. Or it could even be a trigger event. Maybe it's an email being received, or maybe it's the conclusion of an upstream process that can then kick off a downstream process, or maybe it's the appearance of a file in a shared folder that the digital worker is monitoring. Really, you've got a lot of flexibility to decide how you want that to work. But once that initiating event happens, the digital worker goes about processing, does what it has to do, and then once it's finished, it shuts down or it goes on to the next process, whatever you're really telling it to do. Now, attended automation is a little bit different. As the name suggests, that does require some sort of human intervention. And that can be really any way. So it can be the sort of work where you have a human manually initiate a process and then hand it off to a digital worker. So if we go back to the contact center example I was just talking about earlier, maybe you have a contact center agent who collects some information from the caller and they populate a form that says it's Mrs. Jones at 14 Smith Street, and she's looking to get her electricity connected. She just bought the house, as a simple example. Okay, fine. So the human is giving some initial upstream parameters, and those are used to kick off the process where the digital worker can then go through and say, okay, I know all this information. I'm going to go off on my own and pull this stuff together and do what I need to do to get Mrs. Jones her electricity. And then maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's the digital worker automatically starts some work, and then it eventually hands it off to a human employee for conclusion. So an example there is the firearms licensing one I gave earlier, where you have the digital worker actually going around doing the collation of the information and doing the background checks. But this particular state wasn't necessarily comfortable with the idea of the digital worker also making a determination on its own. So the digital worker can certainly make a recommendation, but ultimately it's up to the clerk who's doing the background check to make that final determination. So in that case, the digital worker starts, collects the work, and then hands it off to the human to say, okay, I'm done, you take over from here. So those are kind of the differences between attended and unattended automation. And so again, it's really important to just ensure that you have an RPA platform that can do both of those, but also doesn't treat them differently from a licensing perspective, because there really is no one size fits all. You need to be able to ensure that you can really run with any type of process that best really fits your agency or your state's needs.
Okay. So when we're deploying this, should we be deploying it on premises, in the cloud, hybrid? Is there one that's better than the other?
Yeah, ultimately that's up to you. So the nice thing about RPA is it really is a flexible tool, and it works equally well if you deploy it on premises, if you do it in the cloud, if you take a hybrid approach. From Blue Prism's perspective, there's no difference, at least in the licensing model. It works the same way either way. We don't charge any differently. Now, a lot of state agencies, of course, as you might imagine, are really concerned about security, and so they tend to start off thinking, well, we really would rather have this as an on-prem solution just because it's easier for us to control all aspects of it. But that's not always the case, right? A lot of states do have cloud first initiatives, and they say, well, why should the state be running its own data centers when there's a lot of really good commercial cloud service providers out there? And so if you want to run this in Azure or AWS or GCP, you can certainly do that as well. It's really just up to you and to what you want. And we actually have a lot of customers who will start maybe on-prem entirely and will eventually migrate to the cloud. So you have ultimate flexibility. It just depends on what is of most interest to you. We're not going to charge you more one way or the other.
Okay. If I have, and I'm sure that in the States, there are these things. Of course, Massachusetts is ultra modern, so we don't have this problem. But if we have an older legacy application, something that doesn't have a modern API, or something that's homegrown, something along those lines, can we still use RPA?
Absolutely. And actually, it's interesting because I think most people tend to think of state government as being back in the dark ages and commercial enterprises as being very forward thinking. But what we actually see is that mainframes are not unique to state government. We actually have a number of big bank customers who also at the core of everything still have mainframes. It's pretty amazing. So yes, you absolutely can still use it. In fact, one of our recent customers selected us to run their Medicaid program because their Medicaid operations are largely mainframe based, and they wanted to have an ability to create automations within those mainframe solutions, and also to have it work with more modern applications. So and really that's I think one of the big value propositions of RPA, or at least specifically Blue Prism's RPA, is that our digital workers are able to interact with any sort of technology. So it doesn't matter whether it's one of those modern web applications that has a lot of nice, fully featured APIs that let it talk to other applications, or whether it's a custom developed application, or maybe it's a standard enterprise application like Excel or SAP, or maybe it's a mainframe system. You need to be able to interact with any of those. And I think the added benefit there is not only do you have a capability to interact with any type of application and therefore build any type of automation within it, but also if you think about it, what that really means is you also have the ability to actually interconnect disparate systems. And if you think about what that might look like under a traditional software development framework, trying to get a mainframe to talk to a modern API, maybe that's doable, but it probably requires a great deal of time and money and custom development work to make it happen. Well, if you've already got an RPA system, that is a great bridge right there between the two that will actually facilitate movement of information between those systems, but with relatively little effort.
Okay. Last couple of questions, the ones that I saved the best for last. Yeah, so the first one, and it is of interest to all states, I am sure. What is the cost model? How is RPA paid for? Is it license model? Is there hardware? Anything that we need to take into consideration there?
Yeah, for sure. Really great question as well. And so ultimately, it's going to depend on which RPA vendor you choose, because I think they all take slightly different approaches towards licensure. From Blue Prism's perspective, it's purely a software license model. It all runs on commodity hardware that you probably already have in the first place. Most organizations tend to run their digital workforce as virtual machines, either in their own data center or on the cloud. From a licensing perspective, though, it's really straightforward. Blue Prism has a singular license model where whether you buy a license for one digital worker or 100, you have access to all the same things. You have the core automation platform, but you also have all of those intelligent automation components we talked about. So the ability to run analyses about what processes should your process discovery, right? What processes should you automate in the first place? And can you do intelligent document processing, et cetera? It's going to do the full feature across both attended and unattended automation without distinguishing one cost model for another. Fundamentally, that license model is driven purely by the number of digital worker licenses you have. So it's all about how many digital workers are working in your production environment at the same time. So we're not charging based on the number of automations. We're not charging based on the number of human employees or anything like that. We're also not taking a modular approach where we're charging you separately for access to a development environment or the ability to orchestrate your automation. So really, it's meant to be all inclusive.
So is there usually like an upfront setup cost and then an ongoing recurring cost? Is that?
It's also going to depend on how you want to do the automation. So certainly there are some fundamental IT basic costs in terms of, okay, we need to provision our virtual machine infrastructure. But again, most organizations already have that. There usually is a connection to, say, a Microsoft SQL server database, because that serves as a centralized repository for all information contained in the digital workforce. So really what it comes down to is not so much an expense from an additional licensing perspective, but there is certainly at least some operational expenditures that your IT team will have to do.
Okay.
And are there any? Oh, sorry. So in terms of ongoing maintenance, you make some good points, because really, again, all that is just kind of the general enterprise infrastructure health management you would be doing anyway. So all the usual stuff around making sure that you're doing regular backups, making sure that you've got disaster recovery and or high availability in place. But with regard to the actual automation itself, the nice thing about when you're using RPA is that all the components of those automations are reusable. So it actually becomes lighter and lighter touch as you go on, as you build more and more automations, because you're actually building more integrations into more systems. And so if we use Excel as an example, since I talked about it earlier, well, if you've got 50 different processes that are requiring access to Excel, you don't need to build an integration or interaction into Excel 50 times. You just do it once, and it can be reused across any number of those processes.
All right. And when we talk about costs by implementing RPA, are there any offsets to those costs that are achieved?
Yeah, there are definitely some offsets, and that's actually an important part as well. We actually had one of our state customers recently share with us a study that was done by a state university where they were looking specifically at social workers, and they found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the average social worker in the state was spending 80% of their time focused on doing paperwork, and only 20% of the time actually in the field serving the citizens who they wanted to serve, which is disheartening. And in fact, that's a really great example, I think, of why it's very hard to hold on to state employees, but social workers in particular, right? Because they're really focused on being able to help people, and when they're chained to their desk for the majority of their lives, it becomes a little frustrating, and they're not wild about that. Well, when you've got an RPA solution in place, since that is there to supplement the human workforce, why not flip those metrics around and say, well, let's hand off that work, all the paperwork, or as much as we can at least, so that way now that digital worker is doing most of the paperwork, so now we can actually have the social worker or any employee really in the state spending 80% of their time actually focused on citizen engagement, doing the work that they really like doing, and only 20% or less, hopefully, focused on those mundane processes. So I think that's a big part of it. I think also part of it, as you mentioned earlier, comes from just pure employee retention. If you're keeping your agency employees happier, they're going to stay a little bit longer. You're not going to have as much staff turnover, which means you're not spending as much time recruiting and training new employees. So greater staff longevity is always an important part of it. As I mentioned earlier, because it's an all-inclusive license, I think that also, maybe not so much as a cost offset, but from a forecasting perspective, is always very easy then for your operational budgets to know, well, we know that we have this many licenses. We don't need to purchase any of these unknown modules. We know what the care and feeding maintenance type thing looks like. So it becomes easier to budget for. Process improvement is a big part of it too, because as we talked about, as part of the overall intelligent automation offering, you have an enriched stream of information on which you can conduct analytics, and you can look at the performance of your processes, and you can identify opportunities to say, hey, we've already made this process more efficient by automating it, but we can make it more efficient still, which means we can get even more work done. So that's a great way to save money. I already talked about reusability. When you've got reusable components, it means that certainly, yeah, you're going to spend some time up front building everything from scratch, or at least most things from scratch. But once you have them, they're there and they can be reused elsewhere. And also there are other elements like the digital exchange, which is the ability to actually download pre-built assets. So it's all about how can we make life simpler from a development perspective, so that way you don't necessarily have to start with a blank canvas every single time. And last but not least, I would say, since we're not charging a license fee on a per automation basis, what that really means is you're only limited by how many automations can each digital worker do in a 24-hour period. And so if you're not using every last second of digital worker time, that means you've always got excess capacity, which means that you can actually add more processes always. And if you've still got overhead on your or space on your license, that means you're building in more capacity at no additional cost. So I think those are some of the biggest cost offsets that I can think of.
Okay. And then you touched on a little bit of this earlier, but are there any security concerns or anything that we need to take into consideration from the security standpoint?
Sure. Security is always an important thing to think about. And I would say that RPA in general doesn't necessarily have any more or less security concerns than any other enterprise software. So what I mean by that is you still want to ensure that you're working with IT to create a secure infrastructure on which this can run. You want to ensure that you're adhering to to general best practices around things like role-based access controls, using multi-factor authentication. In the case of RPA, maybe even want to put in zero trust to ensure that you're continually monitoring and authenticating, so that way you can ensure that nothing untoward is happening. So I think all that is very helpful. As I alluded to earlier, it's very easy and perhaps appealing to just kind of reuse the human employee's credentials, but it really is a better approach to create dedicated user credentials for those digital workers. If you think about, again, one of the benefits of a digital worker versus a human, humans are terrible at making secure passwords and remembering them, which is why we end up with people doing things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is the bane of every CIO's existence, I think. Well, when you've got a digital worker, you actually have a secure credential repository where you can create these ludicrously complex passwords. Maybe you can have a 50-character hexadecimal special character password, which a human would never remember, but it's ultra secure because no one's going to crack that, and a digital worker has no problem remembering it. So I would say those are big parts of it. And otherwise, it's just, again, doing all of the best practices of continuous monitoring to make sure that you always understand from a centralized perspective, what is that digital workforce doing? I want to have complete insight and control into it on a single pane of glass. So that way it's not a gray IT solution where I know some people are doing automations, but I don't know what they're doing. You want to, at every moment in time, be able to control, to understand what's happening, to have an immutable, robust log that you can look at any time anyone has a question about what did your automation do, I can show you precisely what happened. So those are some of the security considerations that come to mind for me.
Okay. I told you this would be relatively painless. We're down to the last question. And it's the most innocuous one. What else do I need to know? What did I forget to ask you?
Well, I think you did a pretty good job of covering most everything. The few things that I would say, really maybe more of a recap, but I would say don't be afraid of the technology. I think it's very easy to get caught up in thinking, well, gee, this looks complex and I'm not sure I've got the right people and I'm not sure I know where to start. And as I mentioned earlier, really there are many different entry points to RPA, whether you're a novice or you're someone who's got a bit more expertise. And it's something that's great because you can learn this by yourself, right? We have training courses that are available to anyone if they want to figure this out on their own. But a lot of organizations will actually work with a partner, either initially or even long term, right? A partner can be really very beneficial to say, all right, this is someone who is an expert on RPA. They can get me started. They can help me create a framework around this. They can help me figure out what I want to automate and how do I build out my first few automations, and then how do I build out an automation pipeline before they hand the keys over to me. So that's part of it. I would also say, actually, don't think about RPA just as a capability for getting work done. I think it's also interesting to think about this as a potential recruitment tool. And I say that because we've actually seen something really interesting with some of our state government customers who have figured out interesting ways to try to work around some of the staffing challenges they're having. So we have one state who has essentially reached out to people to say, hey, look, come work in our organization and spend 3 years here and learn about intelligent automation and RPA. We'll train you on the software, and once you figure out how to use it, you'll create automations for us. And once you finish that, then you have this new skill set, right? You're trained in what's going to be an increasingly common way of doing work in the future. And so we have trained you at no cost to you. You've made money while you're doing it. Now go do something else, right? Maybe you decide you want to stay in government employment. Maybe you want to move to another agency, or maybe you want to go into the private sector. Either way, but by enticing applicants, by giving them something to look forward to in terms of training, I think that's very powerful. And related to that, we have another state government that actually is working in conjunction with some state universities to say more or less the same thing. Hey, come work here, learn RPA. But in addition to getting this on-the-job training and a paycheck while you're doing it, you're also going to earn college credit. So those are two great examples of where you can have maybe a way for people to build skills without going to college, which is very important because I think not everyone wants to or even needs to go to university. And conversely, if you want to go to university, hey, what a great way to kickstart your career. So I think that's really important. And the last thing I'll close on here is again, just don't let RPA overwhelm you, right? You're going to have to spend some time to do this right, to put in the groundwork up front, but you're always going to have someone to help you, whether it's the actual vendors themselves who can tell you what their best practices are, whether it's a partner organization, whether it's another state who's done this, who can also help you figure out how to do it. So that's really the last thing that I have to add.
Cool. All right. Well, we're at the end of another session, and I find myself, as I have every time, a little bit smarter, hopefully, for the information. This one is really interesting to me, and working on implementing a call center right now, a new contact center, and hopefully going to be putting some of this into play so that we can limit those hold times that you talked about earlier. But I thank you very much. This was very informative, and hopefully the rest of the IT folks who are watching this will get something out of it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate the time. And to anyone who's watching who wants to know more, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're more than happy to spend some time talking in greater depth about what RPA is and how it can be beneficial for you.
Excellent. All right. So for the folks watching, if you want to reach out, it's James Spencer, the Director of Solution Engineering for Public Sector Markets at Blue Prism. And you can find him in the NASTD directory. And if you have any other ideas for future sessions, here, whether you're in the corporate community or a state member looking to gather information about something, please reach out to me, brad.steele@mass.gov. And so this brings to end another IT 101 series session. And thank you all for watching.
Bye-bye.